jump right into it. Venezuela. What is the Trump administration doing with regards to Venezuela? What on earth is going on? Generally, if you're going to attack a country, you don't want to give them time to prepare. But Donald Trump has been building up the military forces in the Caribbean since August. And they've been building and building and building and building and building since August. They've been shooting down boats since August. Over 83 people have been killed. They've been threatening to attack and gradually building up their forces since August. It is now December. They have not yet directly attacked Venezuelan soil. They've sunk a bunch of boats, and they've done so under false pretenses. And on top of that, the amount of troops that they have assembled are not enough to carry out an actual ground invasion to overthrow the government. So what is going on? What is going on? Now, the rumor is, what we're hearing in mainstream media is that there are going to be strikes on Venezuela. Let's see. Let's see if there are strikes on Venezuela. I'm waiting to see. But tonight, I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of the Bolivarian Revolution and where it came from, because this is really, really interesting. It's really important to what we're doing. I think if we understand the way the world is now, we have to understand where it came from, and that we're largely dealing here in the third decade of the 21st century with the aftermath of the end of the 20th century, the 1990s. 1991 is when the Soviet Union fell. The Soviet Union fell. Most of the countries that had been aligned with the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe fell in 1989. But 1991 is when the Soviet Union fell. 1993, Albania fell. You had Yugoslavia gradually deteriorating over the course of the 90s. And that was all a major setback for the forces of anti-imperialism around the world. They suffered a major, major setback. And what then resulted was that there was a huge amount of austerity, cuts in public spending. And this happened all across the world. Now, the place that was hit pretty hard was the former Soviet Union. They just shut down the economy of the former Soviet Union. The steel mills of the Soviet Union were purchased by American firms. All the workers, some of them had shares of stock that were given, and they all were out of work and had no jobs. So American companies would buy a share of the company, buy all the shares from the employees of the steel mill, and then they would shut it down, and there would be no steel mill. Russia's farms went out of business. Almost 80% of the Russian farms closed down at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union. The fall of the Soviet Union was like a fire sale on the economy of the Soviet Union. It was crazy. It was particularly crazy. Let's check one thing here, right? Just to be sure. Like, let's check something here. Is this? Yeah, so just to confirm, this is the real Garland Nixon in the chat. I just checked. It is the real Garland, and salute to you, sir. Looking forward to seeing you in New Jersey. That is the real Garland, folks. It is not a Garland Nixon impersonator. That is the real thing. I checked. It links back to his real YouTube channel. And we're honored to have you here, Garland, and looking forward to seeing you in New Jersey. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, it was like a fire sale. I mean, they just sold off the economy of Russia to the highest bidder. And they did this all across Eastern Europe. And it was just economically devastating. Naomi Klein wrote a book about this called The Shock Doctrine, which just goes into detail about the results. They had 30% unemployment. Now, 30% unemployment, that's huge. That's a huge, huge rate of unemployment, 30%. The suicide rate was through the roof, the rate of drug addiction. It was a disaster. All kinds of people who'd had a guaranteed job, guaranteed education, guaranteed healthcare were suddenly left out to dry. And the fall of the Soviet Union was disastrous. There's another good book about it called Europe Since 1989 by Philip Thayer, right? This book also has a lot of economic details about how devastating the fall of the Soviet Union was. And in South and Central America, it was a similar process. All across South and Central America, these countries were forced to cut their public services. I mean, they were just forced to sell their economy off to the highest bidder. And in Venezuela, the cost of public transportation went through the roof. Most people in the capital city of Caracas, they didn't have cars. They relied on the buses and the train system, and the cost of it went through the roof. And there was a huge riot called the Caracazo that happened. And in Bolivia, they privatized the water. And, you know, you could go to jail if you collected rainwater on your rooftop. And the natural gas resources were privatized, and the oil of Bolivia was privatized. And Ecuador also suffered devastating consequences. And they had a farm crisis, and people were thrown off their land. It was absolutely crazy. It was absolutely crazy what was going on. And all across South and Central America, you had a devastating economic situation, and it was a result of neoliberalism. Now, the first place that neoliberal economics was ever put into practice was in Chile. 1973, the socialist president of Salvador Allende was toppled and replaced with the dictator Augusto Pinochet. And for the first 5 years of Pinochet's government, he implemented free market economics, and it was a disaster. There was a crisis of malnutrition in the country. There were a number of people in Bolivia that became mentally retarded and mentally disabled because they have lack of food in childhood. Because as soon as Pinochet came into power, he got rid of the school milk program. He got rid of all the food subsidies. The price of food went through the roof. Kids no longer got free milk in school. And as a result, there was a crisis of malnutrition in the country. And the United Nations actually published a study on, how does it impact brain development if you're malnourished as a child? And they did a study on thousands of Chilean children that became psychologically disabled because suddenly their parents didn't have food after the coup. It was an absolute disaster, 30% unemployment. And after about 5 years, the dictator Pinochet saw the economy of Chile in shambles. And he kicked Milton Friedman out, and he started nationalizing industries. And it wasn't until the mid-'80s that Chile had the economic miracle. And there's a lot of lies about it. Libertarian and free market literature lies about Bolivia excessively. They say, it was Pinochet that privatized everything and created the economic miracle. No, the economic miracle came a decade later, long after he had kicked out Milton Friedman, started nationalizing industries, started using the military to stabilize the economy. The idea that free market capitalism was a miracle in Chile is just bull honky. And in the 1990s, all over South and Central America, they were implementing crazy free market policies. And people had their livelihoods gotten rid of, right? People who had depended on government food subsidies didn't have them anymore. People who'd been employed in government industries lost their jobs. The cost of things like public transportation went through the roof. Food subsidies that made food affordable for people were gotten rid of. The price of food went up. It was devastating in South and Central America during the 1990s. The economy of many countries throughout that region was just devastated. Venezuela was one of those countries. There was a small group of people that did okay. They were people that were involved in the oil business because oil was run by BP and Shell and Chevron and ExxonMobil. American oil companies had full access to Venezuela's oil through the technically state-run Venezuelan oil company, but it wasn't state-run. And there were a few people at the top of Venezuelan society who were doing quite well because they were in bed with American oil companies. Most of the people in Venezuela, their living standard went down very dramatically. And so then at the same time, in Cuba, which is the center of the revolutionary anti-imperialist movements of Central and South America, in Cuba, they started having conferences. This is very interesting. In the 1990s, it was Cuba that started talking about neoliberalism. Now, this word neoliberalism gets widely used. It refers to economic policies of implementing radical free market policies, cutting food assistance, laying off government workers, getting rid of government services, right? Neoliberalism. It was Cuba that popularized that term. And they had these conferences to talk about neoliberalism. And it was the Cuban government that brought in economists from Harvard and Yale, economists from China, economists from India, economists from the African continent. And every year in Cuba, they were having these big conferences about how, as a result of the fall of the Soviet Union, neoliberalism was sweeping the world. Fidel Castro started speaking about neoliberalism was the main threat. And in the early 1990s, the communists of Latin America dramatically changed their tactics. And this is really important. It's really important to understand. But in the 70s and 80s, Cuba was designated by the American government as a state sponsor of terrorism. Why? Because in Colombia, there was a brutal US-backed military dictatorship. And so Cuba was arming a group of people called the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia to fight against the dictatorship, the FARC. And in Nicaragua, there was a brutal US-backed dictator named Somoza, and Cuba gave guns and weapons to a group of people called the Sandinistas, who eventually overthrew them in 1979. They had a revolution. And in Chile, you had Pinochet, the brutal dictator. And so in the mountains of Chile, you had indigenous people that were taking up guns to fight against the dictator Pinochet. And who gave them the guns? Cuba did. Cuba was supporting guerrilla warfare as the tactic to overthrow imperialism. And it worked. And in Nicaragua, guerrilla warfare brought the Sandinista government to power. And in El Salvador, there was a civil war that went on for quite some time. They didn't actually win. And in Colombia, you had the civil war of the FARC and the paramilitaries and drug dealers backed by the United States fighting the FARC. And in Chile and in Venezuela, you had a Maoist insurgency. And you had a lot of communist rebel groups throughout Latin America that were getting armed by Cuba to fight against military dictatorships. But the situation changed in the 1990s. After the fall of the Soviet Union, these countries all started liberalizing. Now, what does liberalizing mean? Well, in the economic sense, that meant privatizing things like crazy, selling off government-owned industries, laying off government workers, lifting tariffs and restrictions on free trade, just letting American companies come in and do whatever they wanted, getting rid of public services, etc. But also, part of liberalization was not just market liberalization, but it was also not having a military dictatorship anymore. Pinochet stepped down, and Chile started having free elections again. And in Venezuela, they moved away from having a military dictatorship, started having free elections again. And in a lot of these countries that had been brutal US-backed military dictatorships, they started having free elections again. And in the context of having free elections, but at the same time, having devastating economic reforms that just devastated these countries, the communists changed their tactic. And this is important to understand. In the 1970s and 80s and 60s, all across South and Central America, you had brutal military dictatorships, but those military dictators stayed in power by handing out the goods, right? Manuel Noriega was a military dictator in Panama, and he was backed by the CIA and to fight against communism, but he came to power and he realized to stay in power, if I'm going to be the military dictatorship, people have got to like me. So he built airports and he built universities and he took care of people, and especially a lot of the military. If you were in the military, you were tight with the dictator, you got taken care of. And that's how it was in a lot of these countries. These military dictators could only stay in power by handing out the goods. And they usually did that with the military. The military would have control over big sections of the economy, and the military would hand out the goods. It would be very corrupt and nepotistic, but a lot of people that were close to the military dictatorship got taken care of. They got a good paying job. They got, a nice house, and they were taken care of. In the 1990s, liberalization involved, first of all, getting rid of the military dictatorships and having free election, having freedom. And George Soros was involved in bringing down a lot of these military dictators in Chile and other places. But also, liberalization involved bringing market reforms. And what changed is that under the new liberal governments in Venezuela and in Chile and in Colombia and places like that, you could openly hand out leaflets. You could be an activist. In Pinochet's Chile, if you were organizing protests, if you were known to be a socialist or a communist, or you were organizing protests, you disappeared and they found your dead body in the street maybe 3 days later, right? You could not organize openly. And in Venezuela, under the military dictatorship, if you were a college student, right, and you were protesting or you were organizing, you disappeared, and they might send some of your body parts to your parent as a warning, right? Your parent might get like a finger in the mail, right, or something like that, just to like let them know that you were taken care of. And that changed when the liberalization came in. Suddenly, under the liberalization, with the overthrow of the dictators, one could organize again. And you could hand out leaflets for your socialist group. You could organize a labor union. You could organize openly again. It wasn't a brutal military dictatorship. But at the same time, market reforms were economically devastating people. So in this new playing field, this completely new playing field, Cuba sponsored its conferences on neoliberalism, and the communists of South and Central America changed their tactics very dramatically. And they stopped promoting guerrilla warfare and instead launched a popular front strategy against neoliberalism. And in fact, in Colombia, they no longer had the military dictatorship. The Communist Party, learning what Cuba was putting forward, said we're going to end the armed struggle. And the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, refused to give up their guns. They cut their relationship with the Communist Party. And so Cuba stopped supporting the FARC, and they stopped giving the FARC any weapons. They said, you don't have to wage armed struggle. And the fact that we now support popular front strategies, and they cut their support for the FARC. But in Venezuela and in Chile and in Bolivia and places like that, the communists shifted their tactic. And instead of building a movement of people in the countryside taking up guns against the government, they built a mass democratic movement against neoliberalism. And often it was not a communist movement. The communist parties were part of it, but they were just part of a bigger coalition. One really essential part of all of these coalitions was the Catholic Church. And this is very interesting. The one institution that couldn't be outlawed, right, in a military dictatorship was the church. And often the Catholic Church, which is really a very big part of Latin American culture, the Catholic Church was a place that people organized, and priests were involved in community struggles, demanding healthcare and jobs. And so there were a lot of Catholic clergy who were very much opposed to, cuts in social services, had been opposed to the military dictatorships. A lot of Catholic priests were involved. A lot of labor unions were involved. And a lot of military people. This is also very interesting. But the military had been part of the dictatorship in these countries. But the military, in a lot of cases, you had people in the military that were very patriotic and nationalistic. Right? There's a whole trend in Latin America called Peronism or Peronismo, after Juan Perón, the populist leader of Argentina. And there are left Peronists and right Peronists. And Peronismo exists throughout the region. And Hugo Chavez in the 1980s and 90s was a Peronist. He was more of a Peronist. He was against communism. He said he opposed communism. He had actually killed communists. The communists had fought like an armed struggle against the Venezuelan government. He'd been involved in putting down the armed struggle. But Hugo Chavez said he was for neither capitalism or socialism, but he was for what was best for Venezuela. And he was for Bolivarianism, after Simón Bolívar, the founder, the liberator of South America, the anti-colonial fighter of South America, Simón Bolívar. And Hugo Chavez was a paratrooper, and he was a military guy, a high-ranking military guy, former paratrooper, and he was basically a pan-South American nationalist. He said, I'm not for socialism, I'm not for capitalism, and I love the military, and I love military discipline, and I'm super patriotic, and I'm super Catholic, but I hate the Yankee imperialists, and I hate what they're doing to our country. I hate neoliberalism. And when I come to power, I am going to stand up to the IMF and the World Bank, and I am going to tell them that they've got to stop these cuts in social services. He wasn't a communist, but the communists voted for him. In 2002, let me back up. 1993, Hugo Chavez, this leader of the military, the country was economically devastated as a result of neoliberal cuts, right? There were whole sections of the country that would lose electricity for weeks because they couldn't pay to maintain their power grids. Basically, the way it worked is these developing countries, they get loans from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, loans them money, development loans to build up the country. And the IMF was saying to get your loan, your development loan, you have to cut government services. And so they would, they'd say to get your loan this year, you have to cut all of this money from the public budget. So they would go and cut and they'd get their loan. And the next year they'd say, all right, we're going to give you another loan, but you have to cut even more. And the IMF was demanding market liberalization. And it was devastating the country. And they didn't have electricity in many neighborhoods. The garbage wouldn't be collected because they'd laid off so many sanitation workers. It was devastating the country. And so in Venezuela, you had the Communist Party that was organizing. You had a lot of Catholic priests that were involved in community struggles. You had a lot of military people who didn't agree with it. And you had this military guy, Hugo Chavez. And Hugo Chavez, I believe it was 1993, he tried to take control of Venezuela. And he tried to carry out a military coup. And he took a section of the military and they tried to seize the capital and establish a military dictatorship to stop the cuts in spending. And it was very much an anti-communist thing. At that point, Hugo Chavez didn't call himself a socialist or a Marxist. In fact, at that point, Hugo Chavez called himself a Bolivarian, and his hero was Juan Perón of Argentina. And he was going to carry out a nationalist coup in order to stop the cuts in public spending. And he failed, and they threw him in jail, and he went to prison for trying to organize a coup. And he spent a few years in prison for an attempted coup. And a number of people, of soldiers were killed. There were battles. And he was in prison. But while he was in prison, he said, when I get out of prison, I'm going to run for president. And when he got out of prison, he said, all right, I tried to have a military coup. No more military coups for me. I'm going to take power legally. And in 1998, they had an election in Venezuela. And the election was not about communism, right? It was a popular front. The communists supported Hugo Chavez, but they were a small part of his coalition. There was Catholic priests. It was nationalists. It was labor unions. It was a lot of military people who wanted to stop the cuts in military spending and wanted the military of Venezuela to have more of a budget and such. And they voted for Hugo Chavez. The name of his party was the Movement for a Fifth Republic. He said, we need a new constitution because the constitution that we have is enabling corruption. And he said, I am for the third way, he called it, between capitalism or socialism, and I'm for Bolivarianism, the vision of Simón Bolívar of one united South America. That's what he ran on the election of. I am going to stop the cuts in public spending, and I am for a unified South America. And he won the election. And it was close. It was very close because they called him a dictator. They said he had tried to take power in a coup, which he had. He wore a military uniform. He gave very fiery speeches. He looked like some kind of, the image people have in their head of a dictator, right? Of a guy in a military uniform who pounds the podium and is giving a fiery speech. But a lot of people said, look, shit has gotten so bad in our country. We need a strong man to fix things. And this guy is a paratrooper and he's built and he's super physically fit and he wears a uniform. And he was part black, right? And that's something that the right wing, the people that didn't like him, brought up all the time. He had about a quarter Afro-Venezuelan heritage, right? He was not light-skinned. The rich people, it's funny. In America, we talk about racism, right? And, they have the one-drop rule. If you have one drop of black blood, you're black. It's not like that in Latin America, right? In Latin America, it's almost like shade, right? Like the lighter you are, the better you are. The darker you are, the more you get discriminated against. And the wealthiest people in South and Central America are very light-skinned, and the poorest people tend to be black or indigenous and very dark-skinned. And there's a lot of people that are somewhere in between. And that's a different aspect of Latin America. Racism is a bit different there in that it's more about shade, kind of, right? The lighter skinned you are, the better. The darker skinned you are. In America, you're either white or you're not. It's not like that in South and Central America. It's a little bit different, right? It's how light are you, basically. And Hugo Chavez was a very dark-skinned man. I mean, he wasn't completely dark-skinned. He wasn't completely indigenous. He wasn't completely black. But if you looked at him, he wasn't a white dude, right? He had very dark skin, comparatively speaking. And that meant a lot to people. He was one of the people He was one of us. He wasn't one of the rich, white, military landowning aristocrats full of Spanish blood. He was one of the people. And he was part African. He was part black. He was part indigenous. And he was pretty dark-skinned. And he'd served as a rank-and-file soldier and worked his way up because he was very effective and charismatic. He won the elections. And right after he won the elections, mudslides hit Venezuela. Now, this is very interesting, but mudslides are a big problem. Venezuela is a very mountainous country, and you have a lot of poor people who live in houses that at least at that time, that didn't have, they were like huts. They were not very solidly built, right? And so if you got a lot of people living on the sides of mountains and they're living in huts, if there's heavy rain, those mudslides wipe those people out. They lose their homes, and all kinds of very poor people in the mountains of Venezuela were displaced by the mudslides. It was devastating. It was just absolutely awful. And all these people had lost their homes. But then the whole country was shocked because Hugo Chavez, the new president, got on television and he said, now is the time we've got to do something about this. He said, I am sending the military, I'm sending the army to rescue the people from the mudslides. That had never been done before in Venezuela's history. The military had never yet been used to help people in a time of disaster relief. And Hugo Chavez pulled a card from Juan Perón. That's how Juan Perón, the famous populist of Argentina, became famous. There was an earthquake in Argentina, and Juan Perón sent the army to go rescue the people from the earthquake. And Hugo Chavez had studied Juan Perón, and he said, all right, there's mudslides. And he got on TV and he said, I am sending the military to rescue the people who've been devastated by the mudslides. And the whole country was moved. They had never seen that. And also, the people in the mountains were very, very poor people who were illiterate, who were dark-skinned, who didn't have electricity in their homes. And a lot of people in the country felt like those people didn't matter. Like they didn't matter. The people didn't care about them. But here, these poor people who've lost their homes in these mudslides, the president cares about them so much, he's sending the army out to take care of them. That was a big, big deal. And at that point, he said, we need help to rescue the people from the mudslides. And so I want the people of the country to form Bolivarian circles in their neighborhoods. These were community assemblies named after Simón Bolívar, the liberator, right? And he says, I want you to form a Bolivarian circle in your neighborhood. So all over the country, people that wanted to help people that had been devastated by the mudslides, they formed Bolivarian circles. These kind of community assembly groups, kind of like the Boy Scouts or whatever, get together and talk about how to clean up the parks, get together and talk about how to be better in the neighborhood, stop crime, do community watch kind of stuff. These kind of volunteer groups that organized in the community were created, called Bolivarian circles. And after the mudslides and after the Bolivarian circles were formed, Hugo Chavez was very, very popular. He was like a president who could get shit done, right? They didn't see him as a communist, right? And he was saying at that point he didn't believe in communism. He was for neither capitalism or socialism. He was for the third way. But he just seemed like a president who could get shit done. It was a government of action, right? They were used to what Franklin Roosevelt, my favorite American president, he used to say, the American people have had their fill of do-nothing government. Do nothing government. Now we need the government to roll up its sleeves. Well, that's what Hugo Chavez did. He rolled up his sleeves, and people were like, damn, this guy is getting shit done. There was mudslides, and he sent the army, and he organized us all into community assemblies. He was very popular, and he said, all right, I ran for office saying we need a new constitution. Let's have a referendum on a new constitution. And after that, it passed by a huge number. Everybody voted for this new constitution. They said, this guy, he knows what he's doing. He's written a new constitution. The new constitution passed. And Hugo Chavez was very popular. He was very popular because he rescued people from the mudslides, because he organized the country. He had the new constitution. But then what happened? 9/11 happened. September 11th happened. And Venezuela was one of the first countries to say, we support you, America. We condemn this act of terrorism. They were on board. But then the USA started bombing Afghanistan. And the USA was bombing Afghanistan. And Hugo Chavez had started a TV show. Imagine this. It was like a weekly TV show on Sundays that he had It was a call-in show where he would just take calls. He was like a talk show host. He was the president. It was called Allo Presidente. And it was a show where the president would be on air on TV and people could call in and ask him questions. So they had this national television show that he did every Sunday. Well, after 9/11, he obviously condemned 9/11. He said it was horrible. But then the USA invaded Afghanistan. And so when it was time for Allo Presidente, he said, we don't support invading Afghanistan. The USA doesn't have the right to invade Afghanistan. And he held up a photograph of a child who had been killed by a US bomb in Afghanistan. And he said, look, 9/11 was awful, but two wrongs don't make a right. And what Bush is doing in Afghanistan is not justified. The US invasion of Afghanistan is wrong. That was a very courageous stance to take. At that point, the invasion of Afghanistan was supported by NATO. It was supported by everybody. But Hugo Chavez said, no, it's wrong. And then Hugo Chavez announced that he was appointing a member of the Communist Party to his cabinet. Why? Because the communists had campaigned for him. They had gone out and campaigned for him. The Communist Party had a lot of support in some of the very poor neighborhoods of central Caracas and some of the areas where the labor unions have been strong. And he said, look, I'm not a communist, but the Communist Party, they were part of my campaign. I am going to appoint one member of the Communist Party to my government. Big mistake. So what happened? 2002, the military overthrew the Venezuelan government. And they did it with fake news, right? They took video. You can look at what they did. It was like they had video of people shooting, and they made it look like Hugo Chavez's supporters were shooting the opposition, which they were not doing. They had fake video to make it look like the people that were supporting Hugo Chavez had been shooting in the streets, which they were not doing. And they said, oh, look, this guy's a crazy dictator. His people are shooting. We got to overthrow him. The military arrested him at the presidential palace. He was arrested and they declared a new government. But the rank and file soldiers rose up because they liked Hugo Chavez, and they seized the presidential palace and they brought him back to power. And in 2002, the coup was defeated and Hugo Chavez was restored to his rightful place as president. And at that point, he was very, very popular, right? And he had defeated the coup, and he came back into power in 2002. And then he realized, look, even though he had not been a communist, even though he had not been an advocate of socialism, he realized that the only way he could stay in power was to build up a mass movement to support him, and that he needed a lot of friends. And so Hugo Chavez made a deal with the Cuban government to start supplying doctors to Cuba. They used Venezuelan oil money to pay Cuban doctors to come to the country and give free medical care to people in Venezuela. That was a very, very dramatic move. And then on top of that, what else did they do? They decided they were going to wipe out illiteracy in the country, and they hired Cuban literacy volunteers, and thousands of Cubans came. They paid Cuba lots of money, and Cuba sent literacy people there, and they had a campaign to wipe out illiteracy in the country. And they did it, and the United Nations gave them awards and honors for it. They wiped out illiteracy in Venezuela. There were lots of impoverished people who didn't know how to read and write, and they wiped out illiteracy in the country. It was a very, very big deal. And Hugo Chavez was very popular. And at the time, 2003, the USA invaded Iraq. And what happened was the oil prices shot through the roof, right? A major oil producing country was blown to bits and blown off the market. And so at that point, the oil prices were very high. And Hugo Chavez changed the way the state-run oil company worked. So all the oil money went into the government budget. And with that oil money, they paved the roads all over the country, and they built healthcare clinics. They built 20 new public universities. They completely changed the country. And Hugo Chavez was wildly popular for doing that. The country changed very, very dramatically. And that is how Bolivarian socialism came to power. They changed their tactics. They changed to win, right? And this is the important thing. They changed to win. Now, Hugo Chavez was in power, and it was oil socialism, petro-socialism, right? They were using public ownership of oil to bring in lots of money for the government, and the government was using that money to build the economy. And so what happened? Hugo Chavez died. After Hugo Chavez died, Obama dropped the oil prices. In 2014, there was the very dramatic oil price drop, where Saudi Arabia was pumping oil onto the international markets and just driving the price down. It dropped below $30 a barrel of oil. And so at the same time that Hugo Chavez had died and Nicolas Maduro became his successor, at the same time, the price of oil dropped very dramatically. So the amount of state revenue that they had happened. And then the USA cranked up the sanctions. All kinds of Venezuelan government bank accounts were stolen. I mean, billions of dollars of Venezuela's money in British banks and American banks was just stolen. They made it pretty much illegal for any company to import products to Venezuela. They went out of their way to just completely devastate Venezuela's economy. And there were sanctions that made it so they couldn't import food from outside the country, and there was the oil price drop, and it just devastated the Venezuelan economy. And that's when I visited Venezuela in 2015, and I was there, and I saw what I saw in Venezuela was a lot of people were very frustrated. And what was interesting to me was that, again, there's this arrogance from people who talk about it, right? Well, they all hated communism. No, I met many people who voted for the opposition party, the Movement of a Democratic Roundtable, the MUD. And many of those people from the MUD, they told me they were socialists. They said, we love socialism. And in fact, Henrique Capriles, who was the MUD candidate, said he was a socialist as well. They just said they weren't anti-American. They wanted to get along with America. They accused Maduro of being corrupt. And that's an important thing, right? There's this arrogance that people, they talk about, oh, communism, social. No. Like, the people in Venezuela are very solidly in favor of a planned economy and social programs and things like that. The difference was there was a feeling that when the amount of oil revenue in the country very dramatically went down, and the ability to import foreign products like toilet paper and things like that dramatically decreased, there was a feeling in the country that Maduro was not handling it right or something. That's what that was about. And I was there and I talked to people. There was not anti-communism on the streets of Venezuela. There were a lot of people that were mad at the government, and in the wealthy neighborhoods, you had anti-communism. You had, people that were, but among, most people in Venezuela, there was largely support for Maduro, or there were people that were frustrated with aspects of the way Maduro had been governing. They said they liked Hugo Chavez, they didn't like Maduro, that kind of thing. And, Venezuela was in a crisis in 2015, and things got very bad. 2015, 2016, 2017, things were very, very bad in Venezuela. But then things started to improve because of Iran, right? Iran started, bringing food to Venezuela. And Venezuela, they had to have a revolution in farming and start developing their own farming because they couldn't import food from other countries. And now Venezuela's food crisis is over. They're not having a food crisis. But the most crazy thing, though, is that the opposition that opposed Maduro went out of their way to make the food crisis worse. For example, they burned food. Right? Well, they're saying, oh, socialism is so bad, we don't have food. So why were they burning food warehouses? Right? And the opposition was violent. They strung wires across intersections so that when a cop went by on his motorcycle, it would cut his head off. They bombed buses. They bombed universities. The opposition, there's a layer of people in Venezuela that are just violently hostile to Maduro. They're agents of imperialism. There's a layer of people in Venezuela that more or less support Maduro, or they think it's better, but maybe he's made some mistakes or whatever. And then there's a layer of people that are very, very loyal to the revolution. And that's Venezuela right now. And right now, Venezuela has largely recovered from how things were. Things were very bad in Venezuela. 2015, 2016, 2017, things were very, very bad. One thing that happened in Venezuela in around 2014 is that all the fake leftists stopped supporting Venezuela. When Hugo Chavez was president of Venezuela, at that point, all the liberals supported Venezuela. Noam Chomsky loved Venezuela. Amy Goodman loved Venezuela. All the woke, liberal, Hugo Chavez had come to the UN and called Bush the devil. All the activist, liberal, academic people, they all loved Hugo Chavez. But 2015, when suddenly Obama was the president and Venezuela was having a hard time, that's when they all changed their minds. Jacobin magazine smeared Venezuela viciously, and all the woke liberals suddenly stopped supporting Venezuela, calling it a dictatorship, whatever. And very, very interesting. Very, very interesting, the timing, isn't it? But Venezuela pulled through. And the reason they pulled through, I saw when I was there. There is a layer of people in that country that are ready to go down fighting. They believe in the revolution. And that I was on Jamarl Thomas' show this morning, and I talked about this. Venezuela is different. It's different than the way Americans understand the left, right? That government would be considered a leftist government, yes. But abortion is illegal in Venezuela. Gay marriage is illegal in Venezuela. And the leftism is very military. It's very tied in with the military. It's very nationalistic and patriotic. And it's quite socially conservative. And a lot of the rhetoric of socialist leaders, not just Maduro, but also there's many different parties in the coalition, right? It's the Patriotic Pole, it's called. And you have the United Socialist Party, you have the Communist Party, you have the Homeland for All Party, you have the Tupac Amaro Party. There's a lot of different communist and socialist and different parties that are part of that. Their rhetoric is very Christian. They talk about the Bible a lot. They talk about the oppressed and Jesus, and it's different. It's not woke American leftism, right? It's not, your 20-year-olds with nose piercings who think all Republicans are Nazis and are obsessed with the trans issue. It's not that at all, right? Being a socialist in Venezuela is about loving your homeland, right? The name of the coalition is called the Patriotic Pole. And the most socialist or communist people in Venezuela are the military. It's the military. In fact, Maduro is a former bus driver, but Hugo Chavez was a former paratrooper. The military of Venezuela is trained in Cuba, actually gets its training in Cuba. They also have these Bolivarian militias all throughout the country, where people get their military training, and all kinds of people have guns. That's another thing. People say guns are illegal in Venezuela. That is not true. Guns are everywhere. In fact, gun violence is a little bit of a problem, right? There's, with crime and stuff, there's a little bit of gun violence, but most Venezuelans own a gun. In fact, I think it's like the overwhelming majority of Venezuelans practice private gun ownership. And they now have these militias, Bolivarian militias, that are alongside the regular army, ready to defend the country. And so I look at what's happening there, and I feel like we should learn from the Bolivarian Revolution, because they changed their tactics, because their socialism is not liberalism. It's not Western leftism. It's not burn it down, tear it down. It's not obsessed with cultural issues. It's not waging a culture war against Christianity. It's certainly not anti-Christian. It's certainly not anti-patriotic, certainly not anti-military, very nationalistic, very loving the community. And, there's some amazing stuff. Like every kid in Venezuela gets to learn a musical instrument, right? They have a government program where every kid gets a musical instrument, a violin or a trombone or a trumpet. And you know what they play on those instruments? They play classical music. Oh my God, they're Nazis, right? Classical music, they must be Nazis, but it's true, right? There's a orchestra is taught to Venezuelan young children, and with the oil money from the government, they buy the kids instruments, and those kids learn to play Bach and Beethoven and Haydn. I mean, it's socialism in Venezuela, right? It started out as an anti-austerity coalition government, and it kind of became socialist because of attacks. It was divisions in the ruling class and a Popular Front alliance and a dramatic change in tactics, all led to Venezuela becoming a socialist, anti-imperialist state. And the socialism there it's a lot like the socialism of Cuba, the socialism of North Korea, the socialism of China. It's a socialism that is about loving the country, loving the homeland, hating the imperialist, and wanting to raise the people up and wanting to march forward, wanting the next generation of young kids to be empowered. It's not woke leftism. It's not Trotskyism. It's not synthetic woke leftism. It is like Stalin. It is real socialism, right? It is socialism in one country. It is innovationism. We call it innovationism. It is faith in humanity. It is love for humanity. It is optimistic. It is constructive. That is Venezuela's socialism, Bolivarian socialism. And that is what the United States, I guess, is going to attack. But I'm waiting for it to happen. If you're really going to attack a country, you do it quickly. You don't give them months and months to prepare, right? And also, I mean, if you're going to bomb a country, you do it quickly. You don't give them time to move everything out of everywhere. And I don't know what's going to happen. I really have no idea what's going to happen, right? And we're just going to have to wait and see. But I'll tell you that the Venezuelan people will go down fighting, and they will fight heroically to defend their revolution. And if Trump bombs Venezuela, that is going to sink his approval ratings. His approval ratings are already low. They're in the toilet. And if he bombs Venezuela, or if he tries, God forbid, a ground invasion of Venezuela, that is really going to devastate Trump's approval ratings. He better not do it. He better not do it. And you get the impression when you listen to the White House, they don't know what they're doing, right? It appears the White House wanted Maduro to come to the United States and have a face-to-face meeting with Trump. And Maduro said, I'm not going to do that because you'll arrest me, because I'm wanted. You've got a warrant for my arrest. You've called me a drug dealer. And the U.S. leaders looked at that and they said, oh, yeah, that's true. They don't know what they're doing. There are some people in the Trump administration, Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth, that are warmongers and are tied in with the Miami mafia, the militarist right wing. There are some people like Tulsi Gabbard that want to not use military force. There are some people who probably don't know what they want. And I think at the end of the day, Trump just wants to be popular. He just wants to be remembered as a good president. He wants to be popular. He wants to set up for Trumpism and MAGA to continue as a brand long after he's in office. I think they just don't know. I think Trump just doesn't know what he wants to do. And that's the situation we're in. So I would say now is the time to be screaming from the heavens, hands off Venezuela. But now is also the time to study what the Venezuelans have done and try. We need a movement like what they did in Venezuela here, a movement against austerity, a movement that is patriotic and loves the country, a movement that mobilizes people to work in their own economic interest. We don't need woke leftism. Woke leftism, synthetic left, that's the whole point of CPI. We always said out of the movement to the masses, out of the movement to the masses. We don't want to be part of the idiotic layer of U.S. society that call themselves communists. We want to build a mass movement to rescue America from globalism, imperialism. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. And Venezuela is a great model of such a government coming into being, building a mass anti-austerity movement, demanding that the government take action to help the people, right? And that coalition, an anti-monopoly coalition against the cuts and austerity, taking power and moving the country towards socialism, that's the kind of movement that we need here in America.